There are moments in parenting where everything changes in an instant, where 1 second erases all the progress you have made, where a single event can silence a child in ways that therapy sometimes cannot break. There are also moments where healing arrives from an unexpected direction, where someone appears in your life at precisely the moment when you need them most, and where the intersection of trauma and discipline, of pain and purpose, creates the possibility for transformation that seemed impossible just moments before. This is the story of a Korean organized crime boss, a child stolen from himself by witnessing unspeakable violence, and a Black woman who walked into their home with a secret that would transform suffering into strength, and silence into something far more powerful than words could ever be. His name is Park Min-joon, and on the surface he is exactly what you would expect a powerful man to be. Confident, commanding, respected by his associates, feared by his enemies. Min-joon is 47 years old, with the kind of presence that fills a room before his body enters it. He was born into organized crime. His father, Sung-ho Park, was one of Seoul's most notorious crime bosses, a man who built his empire through violence, through strategic acquisitions of territory, through an absolute refusal to tolerate disloyalty. Min-joon was raised in that world, trained in that world, educated in the mechanics of power through observation and participation. By his 30s he had become his father's successor, a man who understood not just the physical operations of organized crime, but the psychological manipulation, the political relationships, the intricate dance of power that kept empires alive. But Min-joon had one vulnerability that his father never had. He had a son. His name is Park Tae-oh, and Tae-oh is 8 years old at the beginning of this story. Tae-oh was born to Min-joon's wife, Ki-woo, a woman who Min-joon met in university and loved with a ferocity that surprised everyone who knew him. Ki-woo was not from the underworld. She was an artist, a painter who created beautiful, expressive works that hung in galleries across Seoul. She was the kind of person who could make Min-joon remember that there was a world outside of violence and blood and strategic murders. She was a woman who believed in beauty, in creation, in the possibility that life could be about building things rather than destroying them. For the first 8 years of Tae-oh's life, Min-joon managed something that most men in his position never achieve: balance. He had his business during the day, the operations that required him to be ruthless, the decisions that demanded blood, the meetings where he had to demonstrate that he was strong enough to lead his organization. But he came home to a house where his son was growing up in a world of art, music, laughter, and unconditional love. He read stories to Tae-oh at night. He taught him Korean history. He showed him paintings that Ki-woo had created specifically for their son. He was the kind of father that few men in the criminal world ever become: present, engaged, devoted. But on March 15, 2022, everything ended. Min-joon was at a meeting with his advisors, planning the expansion of his operation into new territories, discussing which regions were vulnerable, which competitors were weak, which opportunities existed for consolidation and growth. Ki-woo was at home with Tae-oh, preparing dinner in the kitchen, planning to take him to his art class the next morning. And a rival Yakuza faction, seeing an opportunity, made a move that would reshape Min-joon's entire existence. They sent a team into his home. The team was small, just 4 men, trained operatives with specific instructions. They didn't intend to take anything. They intended to send a message. They intended to demonstrate to Min-joon that his family was vulnerable, that his world of balance was an illusion, that in the underworld, weakness is the most dangerous thing a man can possess. They intended to show him that no matter how powerful he was in the business world, there were consequences to his decisions, there were prices to be paid, there were ways to hurt him that went beyond direct confrontation. They entered through the back door. Ki-woo heard them immediately. Her artist sensitivity made her hyper-aware of disruption, of wrongness, of things that didn't belong in her carefully constructed domestic space. He grabbed Tae-oh, tried to run, tried to reach the front entrance. But the team was faster. They cornered her in the hallway between the kitchen and the living room. And what happened next? The violence, the desperation, the absolute finality of it, happened in front of her son. Ki-woo died trying to protect Tae-oh. She threw herself in front of the knife, the gun, the final act of violence that her body couldn't withstand. She died whispering to her son, "Don't make a sound. Don't tell them where you are. Stay silent and stay safe." Those were her last words. Those were the final things that Tae-oh heard from his mother's mouth. And those instructions, given in a moment of desperate love, would shape the next 2 years of his life in ways that no one could have predicted. Teo, at 8 years old, having just watched his mother die, having just heard her final instruction to be silent, learned that lesson so completely, so deeply, that after the security team found him hiding in the closet, screaming silently, his mouth open but no sound emerging, he never spoke again. Not a word. Not a sound. For 18 months after his mother's death, Park Teo existed in a world of absolute silence. He went to school. He attended therapy sessions 3 times a week with Dr. Lee, a trauma specialist who had worked with dozens of children who had experienced witnessing murder. He ate, he slept, he existed in all the physical ways that people exist. But the part of him that made sound, that made connection, that participated in the world through language, that part of him was gone. Min-jun, in his grief, made a decision that surprised everyone in his organization. He stepped back from active operations. His second-in-command, a man named Jin-soo, took over the day-to-day management of the business. Min-jun devoted himself entirely to his son, trying to heal the wound that could not be healed, trying to find a way to bring Teo back to himself. He hired the best therapists in Seoul. He took Teo to specialists in Tokyo, then in New York, then back to Seoul. He spent millions of dollars trying to break through the silence, but the silence remained. The boy communicated through writing, through gesture, through the elaborate system of nonverbal communication that he had developed. But he did not speak. And as the months passed, it became clear that this was not something that could be fixed through talk therapy alone, not something that could be resolved through conversations with psychologists, not something that would respond to the traditional tools that the mental health establishment had developed. Until Amara Johnson walked into his life. Amara Johnson is 34 years old, and her resume would seem, on the surface, perfectly suited for a position as a nanny in a wealthy household. She had worked as a caregiver for 15 years. She had references from families across the United States and South Korea. She had certifications in childhood development, nutrition, safety protocols, and early trauma response. She had been trained in first aid, in conflict de-escalation, in the kinds of practical skills that wealthy families wanted to know their childcare providers possessed. What her resume did not mention was that she had grown up as the daughter of Colonel James Johnson, one of the most decorated Special Forces operatives in modern military history. What it did not mention was that she had spent her 20s training as an elite soldier herself, before leaving the military after a personal tragedy that she has never publicly discussed. What it did not mention was that she understood violence not as an abstract concept, but as something that lived in the body, in muscle memory, in the kind of training that never leaves you, that becomes as fundamental to who you are as breathing. When Amara saw the job posting for a live-in nanny for a wealthy Seoul family, family name withheld, discretion essential, single child, special requirements preferred, she understood immediately what was being asked of her. The language was coded, but to someone with her background, the meaning was clear. This family needed someone who understood trauma, who could handle crisis, who could provide something that traditional therapy could not. She researched the family. She discovered who they were, what Min-jun did, what kind of world this child inhabited. And she made a decision. She would apply for the position. She was hired by Min-jun's assistant, a woman named Ms. Park, no relation, who conducted the entire interview process without ever mentioning to Min-jun that Amara had a military background. Ms. Park saw something in Amara that suggested she was exactly what the household needed: compassion, discipline, and an absolute refusal to treat the child with pity. Ms. Park had seen too many caregivers come through the Min-jun household, each one treating Teo as if he were made of glass, each one speaking to him in the condescending tones that people use when they are talking to someone they believe is damaged. Ms. Park understood that Teo needed something different. Amara seemed to understand that too. Amara's first week in the Park household was devoted to observation. She watched Teo move through his day in complete silence. She watched his father try to engage with him, watched the desperation in Min-jun's eyes as every attempt at connection was met with the boy's absolute stillness. She watched the household staff treat Teo as if he were made of glass, as if any pressure might shatter him completely. She watched the way that Teo seemed to have withdrawn from the world, to have created a space inside himself where he was protected from further harm. And she understood, with a clarity that comes from her training, that this approach was wrong. That Teo didn't need to be treated like glass. He needed to be treated like someone with strength that he hadn't yet discovered. During the second week, Amara began introducing structure. She established routines for Teo, not rigid, not punitive, but purposeful. Wake time became a ritual. She would come to his room at 5:30 a.m., open the windows, let sunlight flood in, and begin the day with intention. Breakfast became an exercise in preparation. She involved him in cooking, in the physical act of creating something, in the sensory experiences of taste and smell and texture. The afternoon became devoted to activities that required focus, discipline, and the kind of physical engagement that allows the mind to reset. She didn't speak to Teo about his trauma. She didn't ask him questions about how he felt. She simply created an environment where silence was not the default state, where engagement was expected, where the body was treated as something capable rather than something fragile. But the real transformation began 3 weeks into Amara's employment, and it happened in the kitchen. Teo was supposed to be doing homework. Minjun was in his study, handling administrative tasks related to his business, trying to maintain the operations that had been delegated to him even though his heart was not in it. The household staff was in various rooms attending to their duties. Amara was in the kitchen preparing ingredients for that evening's meal, a deliberate choice because she wanted Teo to understand that the kitchen was not just a place of nourishment, but a place of activity, of creation, of engagement. What Minjun saw when he decided to check on his son and found him absent from his study would become the moment that changed everything. He opened the kitchen door quietly, expecting to find Amara preparing food and his son sitting at the table doing nothing, engaging with no one. Instead, what he saw was something that made his entire understanding of what was happening shift like an earthquake moving through a city, destroying everything that had been built on faulty foundations. Amara had Teo in what appeared to be a defensive position. His arms were up. His stance was wide. His body was oriented in a way that suggested preparation for combat. And Amara, moving with the kind of precision that comes from military training, from years of instruction under the guidance of instructors who understood that perfection in execution could mean the difference between life and death, was demonstrating a wrist lock technique, the kind of maneuver that is taught to special forces operatives for disarming opponents, escaping restraints, and neutralizing threats. When someone grabs your wrist, Amara was saying, her voice calm and instructional like a teacher explaining a mathematical theorem or the proper way to construct a sentence, the first thing you do is understand that your wrist is not the problem. The problem is that you've allowed your body to respond with panic. Instead, you move like this. She demonstrated the movement, a subtle rotation combined with a drop and a twist that left whoever was applying the grip suddenly vulnerable to having their own arm manipulated. She executed the movement with perfect control, with the kind of precision that suggested she had performed it thousands of times before, that her body understood the mechanics so completely that her mind didn't need to direct each action. Teo, silent as always, was watching her with an intensity that Minjun had not seen since before his mother's death. His eyes were focused. His body was engaged. His entire being seemed to be concentrated on the present moment, on understanding what was being demonstrated to him, on learning the technique that was being taught. And for the first time in 18 months, it appeared that he was mentally present in the world, that he had returned from whatever internal space he had withdrawn to, that the trauma had released its grip, at least temporarily, at least enough for him to engage with something outside of his own pain. Again, Amara said, and Teo reset his position. Again she demonstrated the technique. Again he attempted to replicate it. There was no pressure. There was no judgment. There was just the calm instruction of someone who understood violence so completely that she could teach it with the gentleness of someone teaching piano, or painting, or any other discipline that required both physical skill and mental presence. Minjun didn't interrupt. He simply closed the door quietly and walked back to his study, his mind spinning with questions that demanded answers. What was Amara doing? Why was she teaching his son combat techniques? Who had authorized this? What possible purpose could it serve? But underneath those questions, underneath the initial shock, there was something else. There was hope. There was the possibility that someone had found a way to reach his son, a way to bring him back from whatever internal exile he had created. That evening he called Amara to his study. "What were you doing with my son in the kitchen?" he asked, and his voice contained the kind of controlled anger that comes from fear. Fear that someone had crossed a line, that someone had violated the agreement they had made about the care of his child, fear that his son had been placed in danger. "I was teaching him something," Amara said simply, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, no need to justify, no attempt to minimize what she had done. "I'm going to tell you something about trauma, Mr. Park, and I want you to listen carefully. When a child experiences violence, when they witness their mother's death, when they are forced to internalize a command to be silent, their body learns a lesson. The world is not safe and they are not strong enough to protect themselves. Silence becomes a protective mechanism. It becomes a way of saying, I'm small, I'm powerless, I'm not worth targeting. But that lesson is also a prison. And the only way to break out of that prison is not through talking about it, not through therapy that asks them to process emotion verbally. It's through teaching them something that their body understands, that they have power, that they can defend themselves, that they are stronger than their fear. Minjun listened, and something in her words resonated with a part of him that he had been denying. Because he also was a victim of the same trauma that his son experienced. He had lost his wife, he had been violated in his own home, he had learned that power could be stripped away in an instant. And he understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that Amara was offering his son something that traditional therapy never could. The possibility of reclaiming his body as something that belonged to him, something that was strong, something that was capable of defending itself. What is your background? Minjun asked, and it was not a question asked from curiosity, but from the kind of assessment that comes from someone who has spent his entire life reading people, understanding who they really are beneath the surface narratives they present. My father was a soldier, Amara answered. Elite Special Forces. My mother was a psychiatrist specializing in trauma. I spent my 20s doing exactly what your son is starting to do, learning to transform fear into power. I left that world for reasons that I don't discuss. But I never left behind what I learned, that the human body is capable of extraordinary things, and that sometimes the path to healing isn't through tears or words. It's through discipline, through training, through the understanding that you are stronger than you believe. Minjun hired Amara as Teoa's personal trainer immediately, with the condition that she would continue her nanny duties but would also have explicit permission to engage in physical training with his son. The transformation that followed over the next 6 months was subtle, but it was profound in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Every morning, Amara and Teo would wake at 5 a.m. They would go to the gym in the basement of Minjun's home. And there, without words, without pressure, Amara would teach Teo the fundamentals of combat. Balance, stance, the mechanics of force distribution, the way the body can be used to generate power. She taught him martial arts techniques, not as combat applications, but as meditation, as a way for his mind and body to work together in perfect synchronization. She taught him that strength was not about aggression, but about understanding his own body, about knowing how to move, about comprehending the relationship between his physical form and the space around him. But the training was not just physical. Amara was deliberately exposing Teo to controlled stress. She would create scenarios where he had to problem solve under pressure. She would challenge him physically beyond what he thought he could achieve. She would place him in situations that were slightly uncomfortable, that required him to develop confidence not through empty reassurance, but through actual evidence of his own capability. She would say to him, "You can do this. Not because I believe in you, but because you have already done it and you know that you can do it again." She also introduced him to Dr. Lisa Chin, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, who understood what Amara was doing and could provide support that aligned with, rather than contradicted, the physical training. Dr. Chin never asked Teo about his mother. She never asked him to discuss the trauma. Instead, she worked with him on visualization, on understanding his nervous system, on the physiological changes that occur when the body learns that it is not helpless. She taught him that the silence was a skill, not a symptom, and that he could choose when to use that skill and when to break it. After 2 months, Teo began writing again. Nothing verbal, he still hadn't spoken a word, but he started journaling. Short entries: strong today, learned new technique, felt good. The act of writing seemed to create a bridge between the silence and whatever lay beyond it. He began to acknowledge, through these written entries, that something was changing inside him, that the training was having an effect that went beyond the physical. After 4 months, Minjun noticed that his son was standing differently. His posture had changed. Where he had moved through the world like he was trying to disappear, now he moved like someone occupying space, someone claiming the ground he walked on. And more significantly, Teo had started making eye contact. Not with everyone, but with Amara, consistently, in a way that suggested trust, connection, understanding. During the 6th month, Minjun arranged a meeting with the head of the rival Yakuza faction that had been responsible for Kiwoo's death. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a warehouse on the outskirts of Seoul, with each party bringing security. The negotiation was brief. Minjun had already moved against the Yakuza organization through legal channels, through relationships with federal prosecutors, through the kind of economic pressure that comes from controlling legitimate business interests. But he wanted to end this face to face. Your father is dead, he told the Yakuza leader, a man named Takashi, who had inherited leadership of the faction when his predecessor was incarcerated. He ordered the attack that killed my wife. He's dead. Your organization's relationships are destroyed. Your operations are being dismantled. And the only reason I'm not killing you right now is that I've learned something in the past 6 months. Revenge doesn't actually heal anything. It just perpetuates the cycle. So instead, I'm giving you an opportunity. You can take what's left of your organization and disappear, get out of Korea, go back to Japan, and build something in places where you have actual support. Or you can stay and I will systematically destroy everything you've built. Takashi, understanding the genuine threat and also understanding that Minjun had other forces aligned against his organization, chose the first option. Within 3 months, the Yakuza faction had completely withdrawn from Korean territory. But the real moment of transformation came at month 8. It was Tao's 9th birthday. Minjun had planned an elaborate celebration, a party with friends from school, with gifts, with all the trappings of childhood joy that he hoped might finally bring his son back to life. But Tao was not interested in any of that. Instead, he had a request that he communicated to Amara through writing. He wanted to demonstrate what he had learned. So Minjun arranged a private session in the gym in his basement. He invited Dr. Lee, his son's therapist. He invited Ms. Park, who had hired Amara. He invited his closest confidant, a man named Director Park, who had been his second-in-command before stepping back from operations. He invited his brother, Sung-min, who had supported him through the darkest months. And then, with Amara as his partner, Tao began to move. What Minjun witnessed was not a performance, but a transformation made physical. His son, who had been silent and still for 8 months, moved with the kind of precision and power that comes from understanding his own body completely. He demonstrated disarming techniques. He showed balance, stance, the way to use leverage to overcome an opponent larger and stronger than himself. He moved with the kind of grace that suggested his mind and body had finally integrated again, had rejoined after being separated by trauma. When Tao finished, when he bowed to Amara and then turned to his father, his eyes were filled with something that Minjun had not seen in more than a year: confidence. Not arrogance, not the false confidence that comes from being told you're special, but genuine, earned confidence that comes from understanding your own strength. Minjun began to cry. Not the small tears of sentiment, but deep, chest-shaking sobs that suggested a dam had broken, that something he had been holding in check had finally been released. Because he understood, watching his son move with such control, that he was going to be all right. That the trauma would always be part of him, would always shape him, but it would no longer define him. That he had the capacity not just to survive, but to thrive. After the session, Dr. Lee spoke with Minjun privately. "What I'm seeing in Tao is remarkable," she said. "The trauma hasn't been resolved through talk therapy alone. It's been integrated through physical understanding. His body has learned that it's capable. And once the body understands that, the mind follows. I would estimate that within another 2 months, with continued training and continued therapy, he will be ready to speak again." Those 2 months were the longest months of Minjun's life. He watched his son every day, waiting for the moment when sound would return, when his son's voice would fill the house again. He thought about Kiwoo constantly, imagining what she would have said if she could see how their son was transforming, how he was being healed. He understood that his wife had sacrificed everything for this boy, and he was determined that her sacrifice would not be in vain, that her son would become someone extraordinary. The moment came on a Tuesday evening 2 months later, exactly 2 years after Kiwoo's death. Amara and Tao were in the kitchen again, that sacred space where the transformation had begun. Amara was teaching Tao how to prepare a traditional Korean dish, something that his mother had taught her before she died. The recipe had been a favorite of Kiwoo's, something she had made for Minjun on special occasions, something that carried the memory of her in every ingredient. And as Amara guided Tao through the steps, as they moved together with the kind of synchronization that comes from months of working in close physical coordination, as they prepared the meal that was both a tribute to the mother and a celebration of the son's return to the world, Tao stopped moving. He looked at the ingredients spread before him. He looked at the kitchen space that had become so familiar to him. He looked at Amara, who had pulled him back from the brink of permanent silence. And something shifted. He laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a chuckle, barely more than a whisper. But it was the first sound his voice had made in almost 2 years. It was the first indication that something inside him had unlocked, that the trauma had released its hold, that he was ready to rejoin the world of the living. Minjun in his study heard the sound. For a moment he didn't understand what it was. And then he understood, and he stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward, and he walked to the kitchen and opened the door. And there was his son, laughing while cutting vegetables, and there was Amara, smiling with the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing that you have accomplished something truly meaningful, that you have pulled someone back from the edge of an abyss, that you have given someone their life back. Appa, To said, and it was the first word he had spoken in 20 months. Mom's recipe. I remember it. Minjun crossed the kitchen and pulled his son into an embrace so fierce, so complete, that for a moment it seemed like he might be trying to merge their bodies, to make certain that his son could never be separated from him again. And he wept, and his son, his previously silent, still traumatized son, wept with him, and Amara stood beside them, understanding that she had been present at a moment of profound transformation, at a moment when a family was being healed. In the weeks that followed, Teoa's voice came back completely. It was a voice that had a slight rasp to it from disuse, but it was his voice, and it was beautiful. He began speaking at first in short sentences, then in longer narratives. He talked about what had happened, not in the confessional way that trauma processing requires, but in the way that someone might discuss an event that had happened to them, something difficult that they had survived, something that had changed them but that did not define them. He talked about his mother. He talked about the silence. He talked about Amara. He talked about discovering that he was stronger than he had believed. He also continued his training with Amara. But the training had transformed. It was no longer about healing trauma through physical discipline. It was about a young man who had discovered that he loved martial arts, who loved the discipline, who loved the way his body could move. He trained for joy, not for healing. And that distinction was everything. 2 years after the initial transformation, on the anniversary of Kiwoo's death, the Park family held a ceremony. Minjun had commissioned an artist to create a memorial to his wife, a garden space in their home where Kiwoo's favorite flowers bloomed, where there was a sculpture that captured the essence of Kiwoo's spirit. The sculpture was abstract, but it contained within it something recognizable. The gesture of a woman protecting something precious, the posture of someone willing to sacrifice everything for love. And during the ceremony, Teo stood before the memorial and spoke for the first time publicly about his mother. My mother was kind, he said, his voice steady and clear, each word deliberate. She was an artist. She died trying to protect me. And for a long time I couldn't speak about that, couldn't talk about her, couldn't even say her name. But I understand now that silence was my way of honoring her, of taking the lesson she taught me, that sometimes we have to be quiet, have to be still, have to wait for the right moment. And that moment has come. I can speak now. I can live now. And I'm going to spend my life making sure that her memory lives on, that her art is appreciated, and that her legacy is never forgotten. I'm also going to spend my life being strong so that I can protect myself and others the way my mother protected me. Because that is what I have learned from Amara and from my father and from myself. That strength is not weakness, and that protecting yourself is a form of honoring those who sacrificed for you. And as he spoke, Minjun looked at Amara, and he saw in her something that he had not expected to see. He saw someone who had given him not just his son back, but a new possibility for his own life. He saw someone who understood him completely, who had healed his son not through words, but through discipline, through structure, through the kind of love that manifests as challenge rather than comfort. When the ceremony ended, when the guest had departed, when the household had returned to its normal rhythms, Minjun asked Amara if he could speak with her privately. They walked to the garden, to the space that Kiwoo's memory now occupied. And Minjun did something that he had never done in his life. He asked for help. I don't know how to live without the criminal world, he told her. I was born into it. My father taught me that it was the only way to have power, to have respect, to have control. But watching my son heal, watching him reclaim his life, I realize that I've been imprisoned in a way that's not so different from the trauma he experienced. And I don't know how to break out of that prison. Amara listened, and then she said something that would echo in Minjun's mind for years to come. My father spent 40 years building a military career. It gave him structure, it gave him purpose, but it also consumed him. He died when I was 25, and I realized that all the military training in the world couldn't prepare you for the most important thing: learning to live for something other than the mission. You have the chance to do that, Minjun. You have a son who is going to need a father who is present, who is healing the same way he's healing. And you have someone. She paused, and there was something in her pause that suggested she was about to cross a boundary that she had carefully maintained. You have someone here who understands that journey because I've walked it myself. Over the course of the following year, Minjun began a very deliberate process of stepping away from active operations. He transferred full control to Jin-soo, his second-in-command, with the understanding that the organization would gradually transition toward legitimate business interests. He liquidated many of his criminal assets. He donated millions of dollars to organizations that supported trauma victims, that helped children who had witnessed violence, that worked toward the kind of healing that his son had experienced. And he developed a relationship with Amara that was based on genuine partnership. Not the kind of partnership that exists in the criminal world, built on manipulation and leverage and the understanding that power could be seized at any moment. But the kind of partnership that exists between two people who have experienced tremendous suffering and have chosen to heal together, to build together, to create something that transcended both of their pasts. 3 years after Amara arrived at the Park household, Teo was 11 years old and thriving. He was attending an international school, performing excellently in academics, and continuing his martial arts training, not as healing but as genuine love. He had friends. He had joy. He had reclaimed his voice and his life. And one evening, while his father and Amara were sitting together in the garden dedicated to Kiwoo's memory, Teo came outside to find them, and he said something that made Minjun understand completely that his family was going to be all right. "Appa, I was thinking, Amara is here all the time and she helps us so much. Maybe she shouldn't have to leave someday. Maybe she should be part of our family. Officially." Minjun looked at Amara and saw in her face the same thing he felt in his heart. The understanding that love doesn't follow the paths we expect, that it arrives sometimes disguised as a nanny, sometimes from a culture we expected to be foreign, sometimes in the form of someone who teaches us strength rather than comfort. He understood that Amara had given them everything. She had given his son his voice, she had given him a path back to his own life, she had given his family a future. "That sounds like a very good idea," Minjun told his son. And 6 months later he married Amara in a ceremony that brought together Korean and American traditions, that honored the memory of Kiwoo, and that celebrated the idea that families can be built not just through blood, but through choice, through commitment, through the decision to heal together. The wedding ceremony took place in the garden that had been created as a memorial to Kiwoo. Flowers bloomed. The sculpture that Minjun had commissioned seemed to glow in the afternoon light. And Teo, now 12 years old, stood beside his father and Amara, and he understood that healing was not about erasing the past, but about transforming it, about turning trauma into strength, about using the worst moments of your life as a foundation for something beautiful. After they were married, Amara continued to work with traumatized children, but now she worked with Minjun's support and resources. Together they created a foundation dedicated to helping children who had witnessed violence, who were struggling with trauma, who had lost their voices to silence. They trained other instructors in the techniques that Amara had developed, the synthesis of martial arts and trauma therapy, the understanding that the body could be healed when the mind alone could not. But there's something important that I want to address before we finish this story, and that's the reality of what Amara did and why it worked. Because there's a tendency in our culture to dismiss physical training as somehow less valuable than talking therapy, to suggest that the body is secondary to the mind. But what Amara understood, what her military background taught her, is that trauma lives in the body. It lives in how we hold ourselves, in our breathing patterns, in the way we flinch at sudden movements. And the way to address trauma in the body is not through telling someone to stop being afraid. It's through teaching them physically that they have capacity, that they have strength, that they can survive difficulty. Teo's silence was real trauma. It wasn't a choice. It was a neurological response to witnessing his mother's death, a response that was as involuntary as any physical illness. And the way out of that silence wasn't through someone asking him to talk about how he felt. It was through someone providing a structure, a discipline, a framework where his body could learn something new, where his muscle memory could be rewritten, where his nervous system could be recalibrated to understand that safety was possible. So I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully about it. If you experienced a trauma that silenced you, What would be the thing that would finally give you permission to speak again? Would it be sitting in a therapist's office discussing your feelings? Or would it be discovering that your body was capable of something you didn't believe was possible? Because I think for many of us, the answer is the second one. I think we need to experience our own power before we can truly believe we're worth saving. I think we need to understand that our bodies are capable of incredible things before we can forgive ourselves for the things that our bodies couldn't protect us from. Drop into the comments and tell me, what does healing look like for you? What would it take for you to reclaim parts of yourself that trauma has taken? And tell me your country, tell me your city. Tell me where you're watching from, because this community spans the globe and I want to know who you are. What brings you to these stories of children finding their voices, of parents discovering new ways to heal, of discipline and love intersecting in unexpected ways? And if this story moved you, if you felt the emotional arc from silence to voice, from trauma to strength, from a broken family to a family that's building something new, please hit that like button. We're targeting 10,000 likes on this video because this story deserves recognition. This story about a child finding his voice, about a father learning that power doesn't come from violence, about a woman who chose to heal rather than harm, about the intersection of martial arts and therapy, about the way that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is to admit they need help, to invite someone into their healing, to let themselves be transformed by someone who understands that strength and vulnerability can coexist. Subscribe right now because there are 12 more stories about the Park family, about how Teo grows up, about the empire that Minjun is building that's based on legitimate business instead of organized crime, about the way that healing transforms not just individuals but entire organizations. We're going to explore the Yakuza's daughter, where we follow a woman who is the biological daughter of the Yakuza faction that killed Kiwoo, and how she becomes part of Teo's life in a way that no one expects. We're also going to explore what happens when Minjun's criminal past comes back to haunt him, when federal prosecutors attempt to prosecute him for crimes he committed decades ago, and how his family, now including Amara, rallies around him to prove that people can change, that redemption is possible, that there is always the possibility of becoming someone new. We're going to follow the expansion of the foundation that Minjun and Amara create, the way that it spreads across Asia and eventually the world, helping thousands of children who have experienced trauma, teaching them that silence is a choice, not a curse, and that their voices matter. We're going to tell stories about the other children who come through their foundation, about the ways that they are healed, about the transformations that occur when someone understands that the path to recovery goes through the body as much as the mind. I'll see you in the next video. Don't be late because Teo's story is not finished, and the ripples from his healing are going to touch many lives, are going to change many families, are going to demonstrate that even in the darkest circumstances, even when trauma seems total and complete, there is always the possibility of transformation, always the chance that someone will arrive in your life at exactly the moment you need them, always the understanding that healing is not something that happens to you but something that you build, day by day, moment by moment, with the help of people who understand that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but partners in the dance of becoming human again.